They had raided a half dozen craft stores to scrounge up supplies.
We're at 288 now. We're going to get to 1,000 by tomorrow.
We're retooling our resources going into war against COVID. I feel like Rosie the Riveter.
$4.99, $500.
On the one hand, this is really, it's kind of heartwarming, but it's also really sad.
Desperation?
Yeah, I can't decide which way to go on this. What are your thoughts?
I would rather offer our caregivers something than nothing. And at the moment, you know, if the choice is not having PPE or having homemade PPE, we're going to offer them homemade PPE.
Right.
So.
That was a look at PBS's new Frontline documentary, Coronavirus Pandemic. Joining us now is the correspondent for that special, veteran science journalist Miles O'Brien. Also with us, emergency physician and public health professor at George Washington University, Dr. Leana Wen. She previously served as Baltimore's health commissioner. Good to have you both.
It's great to have both of you on. Miles, we're so excited to have you on. I've got like 3 plane crashes over the past 20 years I'd love to ask you about, but we'll skip that for now. And instead, let's talk about your fascinating look at A Tale of Two Washingtons. Tell us about it.
Well, when the pandemic first arrived on our shores, of course, it happened here. I'm sitting in Seattle this morning, the state of Washington. It was the mid part of January. It was one case, and it was supposedly contained. That was the political narrative that came out after it. But if there's one case in these cases, there's usually 1,000. And so I was curious, what exactly happened here? How did they find this person? How did they contain the story? How did they do the contact tracing? What would really lied ahead? What was beneath the surface? And what I found here is that the response was very good. The preparations were very good. And were it not for a little better testing and capability at the outset, they might have been able to contain this pandemic a lot sooner. A lot of why it began here in Washington is because folks here in Washington were really looking. They knew this was on its way, and they were prepared.
Well, let's go to Katty Kay, BBC's Katty Kay. She has a question for you, Miles. Katty?
Yes. Miles, what you're talking about there, that contact tracing, which seems to have been so critical in the countries that have managed this well. Are you getting an indication that during this time we are buying with lockdown, the armies of contact tracers that America will be needed right around the country are being built up? I've seen some examples. Seattle's doing some of it. Massachusetts is doing some of it. Doesn't it need to be nationwide, and is it happening?
Yeah, I think they're doing all they can here. I've been inside these labs. The state health lab here, which is one of the best in the country, can only do 300 tests a day. The University of Washington Medical School, they ramped up testing as quickly as they could, despite obstacles from the Food and Drug Administration, which made it difficult at the outset. Today, they can do about 3,000 tests a day. But that still pales by comparison when you consider the demand and the need. And it's not so much the capability of these labs and the people to actually process the test, but it's the materials, the reagents, the swabs, the supplies. And that's where the national need comes in. This is where if you mobilize American industry and start producing the supplies to make these tests, we can begin to start to really identify the full scope of this problem and begin trying to put a ring around these cases.
All right, Dr. Leana Wen, you have a piece in the Washington Post. It's basically on the 3 key issues missing from Trump's guidance on reopening the country. Number 1, clearly, is testing. Most people understand that without testing, you don't have a roadmap, especially for the asymptomatic carriers. Number 2, you talk about securing the government's role for federal assistance to secure tests, ventilators, and PPE. Right now, the states are doing it. Why is the federal coordination, I guess using the DPA, why is that the only way forward?
Well, Mika, it just doesn't make sense for there to be 50 different strategies when there needs to be a national coordinated effort. We've heard from governors about how they're bidding against each other for something as basic as swabs and reagents to process these tests, or how masks are in such short supply that there is a competition between the federal government and individual localities. And then there's the issue, too, of establishing a public health infrastructure. What Katie was saying earlier with regard to contact tracers. We need potentially hundreds of thousands of new public health workers who can identify individuals who test positive, find the contacts, and quarantine and isolate those individuals. I mean, we're talking about hiring maybe up to 300,000 new people within a matter of weeks. And we can't have 50 different states, each with their own protocols, each trying to recruit their own employees and then training them and deploying them. That makes no sense. We need a national strategy. And that's what's missing so far in our response. And it's going to continue to hinder our ability to rein in these cases. And frankly, we're going to see more deaths as a result.
So from a public health perspective, is the failure to invoke the Defense Production Act and do this on a national level making it harder to reopen, less safe?
It's making it harder to reopen, and it's also extending our timeline. Look, we have to stop looking at the number of cases as a weather forecast, because everything that's happening now, it's not inevitable. It's not like, oh, there's a hurricane that's going to hit us at a certain time. Actually, our actions right now make a big difference on the trajectory of the disease and also on when we can reopen. And so the longer it takes to build all these capabilities, the longer it's going to take for us to reopen our economy. And when that reopening occurs, I just hope that we're not going to see a second surge of deaths, which could occur if we end up reopening too soon before these capabilities are all set up.
So, in the very beginning of this crisis, you were the first to really step out there and explain to people that these social distancing guidelines were real. This is not a snow day. This isn't where the, kids go on spring break and hang out because schools have closed, that this was serious. And if you don't take it seriously, people will die. And that was proved to be correct. So I want to ask you now, how should families be looking at this? Because they can't really depend on President Trump to understand what the temperature is of this problem. Should families be back just like that first day you said that and really staying in completely? And how long should they be considering their life being like this, from your estimate, from what you think, from a science perspective?
Well, you're right, Mika. We have to follow the data and the science here. And what we know is that social distancing is working, that the only way at this point for us to reduce the rate of transmission is to stop the person-to-person contact. And that's what's been working in flattening the curve. That's what's been working to reduce the burden on our healthcare system. That's what's been working to save lives. So families should continue to stay as their unit, their household unit, and try to stay away from others as much as possible. Now, not everyone is able to do that. There are essential workers who have to go to work. There are people who have to go get groceries. But as much as we can, we should honor the sacrifices of all the individuals who have already done so much to miss school and miss work and continue to hunker down. And I know that this is extremely hard. But again, we are saving lives. We're protecting our own families, and in so doing, protecting the rest of our communities as well.
Miles, we've covered your career closely for a long time, and we're big fans. We've seen you follow the airline industry. It's an industry that hasn't had a fatal crash in 11 years. We've seen you follow NASA. Obviously, when JFK said we're going to send a man to the moon by the end of the decade, we did, and we've been ahead in that race ever since. Science, something else you've reported on so much. I mean, when it comes to Nobel Prizes, there's not a close second to the United States. So how did we fail so miserably in the greatest scientific and medical challenge of our time?
It's an important question, isn't it, Joe? I mean, the intersection of science and politics is a pretty ugly place these days, and it's been that way for decades. We could talk at length about climate change and how when the political infrastructure looks at the scientific infrastructure, they don't like what they're hearing. They discount it, they poo-poo it, and they move on for political gains. Looking at science through a political prism has great consequences. People who've been concerned about climate change for a long time have been saying this for a long time, but that's a slow motion crisis that's a little harder for people to see the consequences of, although that's changing. But in this case, in the case of a pandemic, injecting politics in the middle of it and discounting the data and what science are saying has real consequences. Lives are lost. And it's time to put the politics aside and truly look at what the experts are telling us. They're not lying. They are not lying to us.
Well, you look at the battle between science and politics. You also look at the friction between science and economics. And it seems on that front, that seems to be Donald Trump's Achilles heel when it comes to reopening this economy. He's listening to people like Larry Kudlow at times instead of Dr. Fauci, Stephen Moore instead of people like Dr. Birx. Of course, ultimately, he seems to get to the right decision on some of his healthcare decisions, but still, that friction has been underlying so much chaos in the White House's delivery of their message.
You know, it isn't time to be playing a small political game when you're dealing with a global pandemic. It's time to listen to the Faucis of the world, who has such great expertise on this, and to discount that at this time, we do that at great peril. And I think what I've seen here in this Washington is a political infrastructure that's listening to the science and the data and has done the best it can. And there are other states that have done that as well. But until we have a cohesive national approach to what is, after all, a global problem that affects every person on the planet, we're not going to get out of this.
All right.
All right. The new documentary, Coronavirus Pandemic, premieres tomorrow night on PBS's Frontline. Miles O'Brien, thank you so much. And Dr. Leana Wen, thank you as well. Great to see you.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.